Here's a question right here.
Well, I have a two-part question. It's a photography and technical part about the cameras you used and how you set up these and how you developed them and printed them when you were taking the second part of it.
Well, very, very hurriedly, all of the portraits in the book were taken with a 5x7 Deerdorf with a 4x5 reducing back. So the negatives are large, they're 4x5, which means that they have a fair amount of clarity, and I usually carried along with me one little fill lamp, because some of the places that I took them were dark. Some of them were outside. Cab Calloway was outside. Buck Clayton was outside. The rule was that I wanted to take all the pictures inside the artist home or close by their home, because I thought that they would feel more relaxed than if they were taken someplace else, for the most part. And they were all done in black and white. I normally took color of each one with a 2.8 Royale, just to have it. And some of the color ones, there are a couple of examples in the book where the expressions were better on the color, and I just made black and white prints of them. And when I printed the pictures, they were normally, I mean, I suspect most of you are not that technically interested in this kind of stuff, but I mean, it was normally on Bravura paper, sometimes on Portriga, but if it was for an exhibition or a show, it was on a colder tone paper. And today it's increasingly difficult to do that because there are so few companies that make paper, you know, printing paper. If you're some sort of a Luddite like myself who actually puts some film in a camera, you're looked upon with peculiarity. But I'll give you just an interesting thing that happened with film in a camera. Just Saturday, I went over to the Green Market in Union Square, and it was very crowded and everything, and I saw Bill Cunningham walking around taking photographs, and I went up and said hi, and how are you doing and everything, and I looked, and he was still using I would say early 80s, maybe late 70s Pentax with film. And the next morning in the Sunday Style section were all the photographs from Union Square Green Market. I mean, he'd worked all morning and into the afternoon, got the film developed, made the deadline, and had it come out. So, I mean, there are people still taking pictures with film and negatives, but that's what it was, basically. It was an old wooden camera. It served me very well because so many of the people that I was taking photographs of were older, and they remembered from when they were young that people had these old view cameras where they got underneath a focusing cloth, and I'd get out from under the focusing cloth, and what few hairs I had were all messed up and I looked silly, and it was a great icebreaker. I mean, because I looked like the village idiot, and it took a long time to set it up. I mean, it would take half an hour to put up cameras, tripods, and all that kind of stuff. So, yes.
The second part is that there's another photographer that's credited. His name is Raleigh Flex. Can you explain who that is?
That's just a funny name that I used on a long time ago in the 1970s when I first started producing records. I had to do everything. I mean, from being the recording engineer to the designer to whatever, because there wasn't anybody else to do it because I couldn't afford to pay for it. And so I made up a name for the photographer, and since I was using a Rolleiflex camera, I just made up the name as Rolleiflex. And it was because there was a marvelous producer, a guy who I really loved his records a whole lot. His name was Bob Thiel, and Bob made really great records. The last ones he made were for Impulse, and I mean all those wonderful John Coltrane records and stuff like that. But for all of his great production, he put his face on all these records, and there's pictures of him, and he has his name in there 43 times. And I said, I'm not going to do that. And so there's no pictures of me on records or anything like that. So that's what the Rolleiflex is from. We probably have time for about one more question. They said we were supposed to stop at 8, and it's going to be you.
There's been a lot of celebration and hype at the record labels in 2009 about the 50th anniversary of 1959, great landmark year in jazz, a lot of great records that came out that year by Brubeck, Mingus, Miles, Sonny Rollins, etc. And I wonder if you could remind me what each of you were doing in 1959.
Good question. What were each of them doing in 1959? That was the question.
That is interesting.
It's 1959 now.
I never remember. I barely remember the many things like that. No, at what I was doing at a particular time, unless something was going on. If you ask me what was going on in 1958. I could say, well, I was working on some things that were the first things that were being done, and I could talk about that. But just to pick another any number is kind of hard for me.
1959 was a strange year for me because that was the year I first took a group to Europe. I took Dave Brubeck and Dizzy Gillespie and Buck Clayton with an all-star band to Europe. And I opened up a world for me that I never knew existed. I knew it existed, but I wanted to be part of it. But in those days, the festival was run by a non-profit foundation, the Laurel Odds. Louis Laurel, I was the president, and I was the producer. Well, and they were financing this trip to Europe, which lost a lot of money. I think it lost $30,000 or $40,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And I came back, and they fired me as producer of the festival. And I said, what am I going to do? This is my life. What am I going to do? And so John Hammond, and I'll never forget it, because this was an important year in my life. John Hammond, I was the first vice president. Louis was the president. John Hammond was the second vice president. So they fired me as producer. They took away my title of first vice president, and John Hammond became the first vice president. And the first thing he did as vice president was to put a motion, we hired George Wein to be the producer again.
I'll answer the question by changing it to 2 years before. 1957, the most important thing I've ever been involved in my life. There was a producer at CBS TV, Robert Herridge, who's not ever gotten the attention he deserves. He went to me and Whitney Balliet and said, I want a jazz program. I want pure jazz. I don't care if the listeners ever saw or heard these people. And we did it with Billie Holiday, Lester Young. We have a reed section of Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, and Lester Young, Roy Eldridge, Red Allen, etc. And the
Vic Dickinson. Vic Dickinson.
And Vic Dickinson. And what happened was the set was not like the Ed Sullivan Show or the Timex Show. It was the studio. And the guys were wearing hats, as some of them did at rehearsals. And Herridge, we had a blocking session, and Billie Holiday came in, and she said to me, what's going on? I said, well, you know, it's just a blocking session. Well, I just bought a $500 gown. I said, Billie, it's not going to work on the show. It's going to be a live show just like this. And the climax of that show, which I think has been seen all over the world, was a small combo with Billie and Lester in the center of it. Lester wasn't feeling well. At that point, before that, I said, you don't have to be in the section with Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins. He got up and played, talking about the purest blues I've ever heard. And the camera guys had been told by Herridge, don't listen to us in the control room. You take the shot you wanted. And some of you may have seen this, when their eyes kept locking, Billie and Lester, as she was singing and he was playing. And in the control room, everybody, the engineers, the producer, me, had tears in our eyes. And that was it. I went down after the show into the studio, and Billie came over and kissed me. Best award I ever got.